Next, I believe, is security and privacy. Is that right? Paul and Dixie are going to come up, and we'll do, again, something like 15 minutes discussion, then we'll have questions, and then we'll take a break after that.
Okay, thank you, David. So Dixie and I are going to spend, as David said, about the next half hour or so in a short presentation of the outcomes and the things we've been working on in the security working group. And then we really are looking forward to the comments that you will make here today, as well as comments that you will make once you read through some of the products and some of the things that we've come up with so far. So if I can make this thing work. We have a number of people on our working group. They span actually quite a bit of people who have not necessarily maybe really considered some of the issues associated with genetic security before. We have people who have come from the legal profession, as well as people who have come from technology companies, and this group has come together to create some of the outcomes that you'll see. So I want to take a little bit of time to talk about the overall goals of the working group and how we work. So the key here is to create a technology environment that provides all of the various stakeholders, so in this case, researchers, patients, clinicians, an assurance that when the data are made available for sharing, that they are done so only by appropriately authorized persons and in such a way that maintains the security of the data. Now, one key point of what we're doing is that we're about technology and not about policy. So one of the things we had to do in that regard was to sit down and work with the regulatory and ethics group to come up with the right policy. So rather than trying to come up with a technology solution in the absence of talking to the regulatory and ethics groups or in the absence of really anyone else, we've tried to do that in a way that was connected to the other groups. And so this creates then a foundation for what we would like to see as a secure data sharing commons, where organizations that agree to implement the security infrastructure will essentially have the ability to share data more quickly than the current methods for data sharing, which involve sometimes very time-consuming bilateral agreements that take, I know in some of the cases that I've been involved with, they take years to work out the details of these bilateral agreements. And so that work with the regulatory and ethics group was actually focused on a number of key questions that we needed to answer to make the transition from policy, or to create the foundational policy for the security policy. This was done in something called the Data Safe Havens Task Team. I put Data Safe Havens in quotes here. Actually, this is a little bit in reference to Tom Hudson's question, although this was done before he asked that question. Data safe havens actually is a term that not too many people can agree on what exactly that it means. And because of that, you should take that as, well, you should take this task team as being there to answer specific questions about policy and with technical implications, not about creating data safe havens as someone else might describe it. So this has resulted in a consensus position statement, which I think is about to go live on the website. From the perspective of the security, regulation, and ethics, this was co-led by Dixie as well as Kazutu. And there were basically 8 questions that were asked about how will the Global Alliance, in here meaning the Global Alliance members, make data available to users? How will the data be accessed? Managing user identity, and so on. Right, okay. So one of our early outcomes in the security working group was a set of principles to guide how we create our decisions. The full statement of our guiding principles is actually listed below on the website. I've excerpted a number of them here. I think there's 15 total principles, and I'm not going to sit and just go in and read through them. But one of the key ones, and in fact it's the last of the principles listed on the document on the website, is that We want the security infrastructure that we've created to be deployable by the members of the Global Alliance in a way that doesn't have excessive burdens. Now, the only way we're going to find out if that's true is if the members of the Global Alliance, so you in this room, plus other people, actually sit down and look at that infrastructure, test it against your own systems and your own procedures to determine if it is in fact something that can be put in place and done so without excessive burdens. So this is although this is what's currently on the website, this September 26th date, we've decided as of today to move this to a version 1.0 for comment. We see this as a living document and one that will evolve as time goes on. I'm actually going to pass off to Dixie to talk a little bit about this security infrastructure document.
Okay, I should begin by telling you that the security infrastructure document really reflects the common state of practice for protecting genomic and clinical data that are shared across organizations, as well as services related to those data that are shared across organizations. And we really tried in this first version of the infrastructure to use open standards whenever possible and to use international standards so that what we presented would be equally implementable throughout the world. In some cases, we've given a particular, like a particular standard that might be a U.S. standard or a U.K. standard as an option, but we certainly don't say that everybody in the world should address a U.K. standard, for example. So that's what we attempted to do. It is posted, it's posted on the web, and the Global Alliance does provide a link to provide feedback on the infrastructure, and we do encourage you to do that. This graphically illustrates the security and how the security infrastructure is implemented by the different stakeholders within the Global Alliance. There's no one stakeholder that's uniquely responsible for protecting the Global Alliance ecosystem, but really it's a collective effort by everyone involved in the Global Alliance, from the individual consumers, those who actually use the data and services available within the ecosystem, to the Global Alliance leadership. And you notice that in this illustration, the Global Alliance leadership, as David pointed out before, is really an enabler and is not really an enforcement organization, but is an enabler for this ecosystem to emerge, and in our case, for the data and services to be safe within that ecosystem. The stakeholders are the data service providers, the application service providers, and the infrastructure service providers. And the third stakeholder that we have listed there are the data stewards. The data stewards are those who really the individuals entrust in protecting their own data and making their data available through the Global Alliance, as well as institutional data that are made available. On the left-hand side, you'll see vertically a number of requirements or functions that every one of the stakeholders really is responsible for. And then in each of the individual boxes, you see the security services that particular stakeholder is responsible for. In the case of infrastructure service providers, we know that there are a number of infrastructure services that might be provided. They might be a storage service provider, they might be a platform, a software as a service provider, they might be a platform as a service provider. And so really the security functions that any infrastructure service provider would be responsible for is really a function of a relationship between them and their customer, the data steward. So it will vary depending on the functions that the service provider provides. In the document, you'll see that each one of these functions that are listed in this is further defined. The function itself is further defined, and when possible, we've cited specific standards that should be used. Okay, let me go. Okay. There are, I think, 5 high-level control objectives that reflect what we're really trying to do with the security infrastructure. As many of you know, security technology really should be responsive to a risk profile. What are you really trying to protect? So there are no absolutes in security. It depends on, it's all a matter of risk management and a balance between your tolerance for risk and the controls that you put in place. So the high-level control objectives, the first one really relates to security, to effectively manage risks to the security of data and services that are available through the Global Alliance. The second one relates to privacy and protecting the privacy of individuals. So protecting the assets, control objective number 1 has to do with protecting assets. Number 2 has to do with protecting the individual the privacy of individuals. The third one is to effectively manage risks of accidental and malicious corruption or destruction of data, and they're shared within the ecosystem. Control objective 4 is to effectively manage the risk of disruption, degradation, interruption of data and application services, which could really reflect back on the Global Alliance. And the last one is to really manage the risk that unethical, illegal, or inappropriate actions that are somehow connected to the Global Alliance could damage the reputation of the alliance itself and its individual stakeholders, such that individuals might prohibit their clinical genomic data to be used within the ecosystem, or that the providers of data and services might be hesitant to make those services and those data available throughout the ecosystem. And finally, the future work slide is that we know that there is a need somehow, especially related to that the last 2 control objectives I just went over, to have some sort of collaborative effort with throughout the ecosystem that is responsible for identifying potential risks to our data and services, and for responding to that risk, for communicating threats to our data and services. And so that's future, one of the topics we'll be discussing at our meeting tomorrow is how we could create such a collaboration that would be responsible for and have the expertise to be able to detect emerging threats before they actually become a security incident, and share them with other members of the Global Alliance and other stakeholders within the community. The standards for consent management, you'll see in the current infrastructure, we talk about that there will be a need for metadata to identify the consent that an individual has given with respect to the data. But we really are relying, this is something that we're working with the Regulatory and Ethics Working Group to further define the privacy and security policy that will ultimately be reflected back in the infrastructure on how we actually represent and exchange consent information between entities. And tomorrow we'll be hearing one possibility, which is the user-managed access profile. This is a profile of the OAuth 2.0 standard which you may be familiar with, is the standard behind those messages that you get when you're on the web, and it says, this application wants to see your Facebook identity information. It's that standard, and OAuth 2.0 also includes OpenID Connect, which is the single sign-on among multiple organizations. So we're looking at UMA tomorrow as a possibility for managing consents within that OAuth 2 type environment. Federated identity across organizations, as David mentioned earlier. We also want to really strengthen our reaching out to the projects that you'll be hearing about later today, and test the proposed infrastructure against those projects. How well does it fit? How do we need to enhance it? And what works and what doesn't, what more is needed in the infrastructure. And then finally, we recognize more and more, and especially after after visiting with the data working group yesterday, it's very clear that security is not a vertical. Security is really responsive to the needs of the other working groups, of the clinical working group, of the data working group, and responsive to the needs of the members of the alliance. So we really want to, we have a baseline infrastructure there, but we really want to reach out and make sure that our security infrastructure is responsive to the needs of the constituents.
Great. So let's have questions and comments. So questions and comments about security and privacy and the working group. Let me start with just a question, which is, you talked a lot about security. The mandate includes privacy as well. And one of the tricky issues that a lot of us deal with is there's a fair consensus today that if you would put your genome on the web, that would be identifying. But there's a question of aggregated data and statistics derived from aggregated data. And so, for example, one of the things that I think slowed down progress a lot was when the early era of genome-wide association studies, people were putting up statistics for every SNP in the genome. Would say, here's the association of diabetes. We put one up in 2006 before publication, and then a paper was published that said you could identify if an individual was in that, and a policy was made, and all that data was pulled down. And even though actually I participated in a meeting with probably about 50 of you, where we, I think, unanimously agreed that was not a good policy. I'm not sure that policy's yet actually been officially changed in the year and a half since then. But nonetheless, there's now a question with exome sequencing data. What can you put up on the web? And is your working group thinking about questions like that? Not just the security piece, but how much information can be released before you get into what level of privacy breach? Or is that something you might do in the future? Where does that stand in your working?
Yeah, when you first part of your question, I thought, all that's policy, but the breach actually does get into security. I would expect as I just said, the first part of your question, I think, is something we'll be working with the RUWG on, because it's a point issue. And it clearly is emerging policy as well. The second part, I would think that that's one of the values that we would get from a collaboration, and I think it's something that would be addressed by such a collaboration on when do we actually consider it a potential an attempt to identify someone.
That's right. So there's two things. I mean, the first one, maybe Paul wants to get in, but I would say the first one is not just policy, though, because there's a scientific, population, genetic, and technical question of sort of, what can you reveal and what level of identifiability and under what settings. And so I think it will end up related to policy, but I think there are real scientific questions.
Yeah. Yes,
so, Paul,
definitely are.
Yeah, so I think that's a good point, and it brings together a lot of the different pieces of the Global Alliance and actually beyond, which is, for a while, the discussion has centered on the idea of the ability to create, to determine that a genetic data set was unique to an individual as the full and total risk in and of itself. That if you are able to create uniqueness in a data set, you have then created a standard of a very high standard of risk that must be protected against. I think that standard is largely impractical. The power of what we can do with basically all genetic studies requires uniqueness of individuals through the system. Otherwise, it just simply doesn't work. If you strip out all the information that makes individuals unique, you strip out all the other information that allows genetics to be done. So this points to changing the concern from creating uniqueness to actually doing harm.
Right.
That could be defined for someone. And here's where we go back towards a policy question.
No, that's right.
There's a technical question about creating uniqueness, and there's many ways to do that. There's a policy question about when uniqueness equals harm.
And this is very much consistent with the discussion in June of 2012 at the NIH workshop on data sharing that Mike Benke, who's here, and Wiley Burke, if I remember correctly, co-chaired, where we had that exact discussion, that the discussion up until then had been, if you could say somebody was in, let's say, a GWAS data set, you know, you couldn't say anything about them other than they might be in the case side or the control side, that you had done them harm, even though no one else could figure out who they were and let's say their data and everything. And meanwhile, you might do a lot of harm to populations by not letting anyone understand disease. And so a view that actually would look at what the harms are and under what scenarios they take place is a policy and framework question. There's a question or a comment over here.
My name is Luke Emili. I'm from Genexix. I've seen that what you point out is very focused on infrastructure. I want to understand, first of all, if you have discussed about the problem of incident handling across the different aspects we have seen, like legal, etc., because I think that it will be very important to help the people to address a specific incident, because it will happen.
Incidents.
Oh.
Yeah.
It will happen. And so the people, we need what to do, how to act
Right.
from the legal point of view, technical point of view, regulatory point of view,
Right.
etc. It will be a big problem that could undermine everything we are doing.
I was thinking the same. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and the second point is regarding the application security, because of course infrastructure are. I came from 10 years of experience as CEO of IT security company, so this is very technical point. So I don't know if you agree about that, but. The application security is something that is growing up very fast in the PCI DSS, the standard for credit card. They have adopted the OWASP standard for the application development. It is something that you cannot add to your environment. I mean, this is something that has to be embedded in the application you are using or you are developing, right. And so you cannot add it in the as a firewall or application firewall or OpenID or something like
Sure.
that. So that's really a big issue because, for example, if you have a very strong application that manages data and it is not based on a very secure development, it's a problem. You can put everything that you want on a layer of security in front of that, but the security issue will. So incident handling and application security, I think, will be a very big problem in the future for this topic.
Oh, absolutely. My background's operating system security, so I'm totally, it's security can't be layered on top of everything else. That's absolutely, that's absolutely
So it does, but so the implication of the second point about application security is that it would follow that if a user, it's not the Global Alliance, but a member or any user wanted to have confidence, then it's not adequate simply to be operating in a system, but you have to know that any software that's brought to it. And this is where the culture of our field, which is very good, and there's a culture of people saying, I want to bring a method to the data and do whatever I want, but a lot of those methods are often not engineered in any way that they would be, secure in such a, and so we have to think about,
well, that's what I meant.
How that will happen, that we can allow people to analyze the data and learn from it, but also not violate security.
For example, if you have the opportunity to modify an application as an attacker, you could create a very big mess because you could modify the output of everything. So
absolutely. That's what I meant when I kept, you noticed that I was very, very careful not to always talk about we're protecting data. We're protecting genomic and clinical data, but I also said, and the services that use those data, that's what the software services that use those data, absolutely have to be protected as much,
Right.
you know,
And
in
part,
order to.
Paul, go ahead.
And this is also a process. You know, as I alluded to, right now people are sharing data, and data is moving back and forth. It's just doing so in an incredibly inefficient way. And so we're looking to make these things more efficient, and as time goes on, also more secure and more tested and things like that. But I think it's important to remember that we are doing all of this today,
Right.
even in an inefficient way.
And also some ways that aren't safe.
And
They don't-
in some ways that actually one would look at objectively and say, that's not maybe the best way.
Right.
But one of our guiding principles for what we are trying to do is to basically take this risk-based approach to get the right balance between things that are, you know, we can make data security absolutely perfect by never sharing the data.
Right.
Right. So that we actually know how to do that. So the next step is now to support the overall goal here, which is to share the data and do it as securely as possible, balancing all the other
Right.
trade-offs.
Let's take another question or
That's right.
comment. But thank you for that. That was excellent.
Hi, Mike Lynn from DNA Nexus. You mentioned you're not creating an enforcement organization. Thank goodness for that. So I just want to ask, what do you see evolving in terms of assurance and compliance with this type of framework? I think if you look at you know, HIPAA, CAP, and ISO and things like that, you have very distinct mechanisms there for saying you're compliant with those. I was just wondering, what do you see evolving here for all of the member organizations?
Well, we've talked about this. We certainly don't have an answer for that. We've talked about this with the Global Alliance leadership, and as you've pointed out, there are a number of organizations and entities out there that do certification against requirements, certification against standards like the ISO standards, et cetera. And we envision that we'll want to capitalize on those existing certification bodies, but we really haven't defined exactly how.
So I'm
How
hearing,
that's
I'm hearing there are two things in this discussion that I'm hearing as, just as in the March meeting, pieces of work came out of it, I'm hearing two come out of it. We've been talking for some time about this question of, even if when we get to the point where we have good policies and standards, how will incident reporting and compliance work? And when we say we won't do it, what we mean is, we have not said we will do it because of the concern that we may probably not be formulated correctly as an organization and what have you, but it is a critical question. There's no
It is.
basis for doing this if there's no way for the world to know if things are compliant. So I think one task team or piece of work would be, which maybe those of you who are in the room who are expert in other domains might be willing to join, is what are the options for how that could work? What are the models and the plus and minuses so we can come to such an answer? I think also the comment that was made about an incident reporting, I do think that, I agree with the comment that something that worries me a lot is, you know, you read almost every week now about some credit card data breach. We have been lucky in this field not to have a high-profile data breach that has created great societal concern, and we probably should organize ourselves. We should probably do some sort of, what would we, not that we have any authority or jurisdiction, but we would probably say to ourselves, if such a thing happened, who would we want to gather to at least, you know, think about what our response would be? Because no response might not be such a great thing, even if it's just, you know, we probably should think about what we would do in that setting in terms of what statements, if any, or how we could help.
Yeah, let me add, because you reminded me that regarding the incident response, there are some models out there already of international organizations and consortia that have come together for incident response, and we are looking at those because we want to borrow from what's
That's right. So
already
two
there.
deliverables, and then we'll take two more questions. One is around some task team to get at the question which was raised about compliance and monitoring, and the other one, something about what we would, how we would deal with a high-profile incident.
I'm Hatem Al-Shanti, actually. I'm presenting Qatar Biomedical Research Institute. I don't have a question. I'm just going to raise a comment. And if you look at historical data about participation of Arabic population in studies that involve populations and not individuals, it's practically zero. And part of this is not that we do not cater to the consents of and assuring privacy of individuals, but it is we don't cater to governments and different bodies that are scared of getting population data out there. So I think there are two levels when it comes to this Arabic population, and it's a unique population where a lot of the data that's out on the web that all of us can access does not apply to.
No, thank you. And there are projects that are being discussed openly in some of those populations, and figuring out how best to engage and be with that is going to be important. Maybe the last question.
Gary Cutting, Johns Hopkins. David, just to go back to the idea of data breaches, which if you have data that hackers want, they will find ways to get it. So perhaps we could be proactive and think what data we're going to put in these databases, and whether that data needs to be there to do the science, which would mean things like, would it be sufficient to have the year of birth versus the precise date of birth, which makes a big difference in the way a hacker can use that data, and consider that we build proactively a database that is not going to be that interesting for those who need information for identity theft, because that, when you think of harm, is way up on most of our lists.
So I think that the idea of getting to the next level of concreteness, once you've established a framework and being able to offer practical advice of the sort or support that seems like a very valuable suggestion. Other comments from?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good comment. That it's easy to collect more information than you actually need because you might need it someday, and we should think actually about that in advance.
Maybe Arno wants to make one last comment or question. Arno, introduce yourself, Arno.
Yeah, I'm Arno Palotiev, working both in Finland and at the Broad Institute, and just adding to this one, that this is exactly what has already been used in many epidemiological studies when building these type of resources. So again, maybe not reinventing the wheel, but
yes,
adopt.
All right, before, sorry, go ahead.
No, I agree. They're right.
All right, before we break we're going to break, but are there any, I just want to ask the question we'll ask it after each of these. Is there anything that in the audience, someone in the audience wants to suggest that isn't being done, or a connection of the sort we heard about in the previous session where there's other groups doing this that we should make sure to connect with, that anyone wants to bring to attention? Because one of our goals in gathering as a group is actually to make sure we find those connections. All right, with that, we're going to have a coffee break, and we're a little bit behind schedule, so I'm going to suggest we come back at 10, we'll come back at 10:40, so a little bit shorter break. Thank you very much.